Good morning and welcome to California in Focus. This is your host today, Kenneth Trupp, investigative reporter in California. Today we have on Madeline Shannon to talk about some recent stories she's had about the California budget deficit that's projected for this year and discrepancies between the governor's budget and the nonpartisan state-funded legislative analyst budget. Madeline, tell us more about what's going on.
So this week, the Assembly Budget Committee and the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee had a chance to review the governor's budget proposal and, of course, the Legislative Analyst's Office November report that projected an $18 billion budget deficit. The governor's budget proposal, as we know, only projected a $2.9 billion budget deficit, mostly to do with an upswing in the economy and continued corporate income taxes being collected from big tech companies that have high valuations here in California. That's the main thing that just explains the difference between the two budget deficits, and the lawmakers that staff or sit on budget committees in both chambers of the state legislature are having a chance to look over both budget proposals and start the work of crafting a budget that the legislature will eventually approve and that the governor will sign into law as well.
You know, a few things come to mind here. One is I look through your stories and I note that there's an expectation that the federal cuts to Medicare and Medicaid will add up to I think it was $3.3 billion that the state government will have to be making up for. The governor's estimate of about a $3 billion deficit suggests that it is entirely the federal government to blame for the deficit, while the Legislative Analyst's Office, about $30 billion estimate, shows that it's a very small part of the overall budget problem that we face. Do you think there's a reason that the governor had his Department of Finance come speak about the budget to reporters instead of coming out himself as he usually does?
Well, I know that he had the Director of Finance, Mr. Steppenshaw, come out and explain his budget when it was unveiled a couple of weeks ago. He didn't do that himself, but it seems that that's par for the course. He's done that in years past, so maybe it's to be expected that the Director of Finance would unveil the governor's budget proposal instead of the governor himself. Although I was kind of looking forward to seeing Governor Newsom talk about his budget proposal, considering that his name's on it. But I think for the Senate and Assembly Budget Committee meetings that we saw play out this week, I do think that it's pretty typical of Department of Finance staff to come and testify on the governor's budget proposal to senators and assembly members who sit on those budget committees.
Right. So DOF staff at the legislature is generally standard practice. That is true. Another concern, though, that we might have with these numbers is the so-called billionaire wealth tax that was proposed led to a high volume of wealth to leave the state before the retroactive tax, which is going to be voted on by voters later this year, most likely. It would have taxed people on their wealth that they had if they were still in the state as of January 1st. So they had to leave by the end of last year to not possibly face this massive tax, which is on includes unrealized gains. It includes equity that you have as voting shares so you can still control your company. And apparently, billions and billions of dollars have left the state as a result. Have you heard anything about this in the budget process?
Not necessarily. That really hasn't been a focus in either of the budget committee meetings that I've attended this week. But it is certainly something to keep an eye on if the billionaire's tax does get on the ballot later this year. So that remains to be seen.
My point, though, is the people have already left, and that the departures would not have been done in time for the calculations of either the LAO or the governor's budget. They wouldn't have known how much would have been lost from these individuals leaving, how many businesses, how many jobs might have come with them. This could be a major headwind for the budget process. When we also look at the LAO prior assessments of the state of the budget, they share lots of concern that we have a very strong stock market, but one that perhaps might be reaching bit of a bubble or have some kind of correction or dip soon, if not an outright recession, which would significantly change the state of our budget as well. Um, Not to mention that it seems like a lot of program spending is set to increase, at least from what that initial budget proposal um, did say. So the question is, what else did the governor's office have to say, or the Department of Finance, about why their projections were so different from the LAOs?
Well, I think the biggest reason is that they're counting on continued high valuations of big tech companies, mostly spurred by AI. There's a number of big tech companies headquartered here in California that have invested heavily in artificial intelligence technologies in recent years, and that has allowed them to have their stock go up and up and up, and allowed them to pay higher and higher amounts of corporate income taxes. So those cash receipts and those collections for the state have been able to pad some of the state's reserves and allow them to collect enormous amounts of corporate income taxes. So the budget projection put forth by the governor and the California Department of Finance are really counting on that to continue. And of course, that does rely on a really rosy outlook on the economy and the stock market and the overall health of these big tech companies. But that was one of the big reasons for why the governor's budget proposal only included a $2.9 billion budget deficit, not an $18 billion budget deficit, which is what the Legislative Analyst office projected. Of course, both projections do include funding to both K through 12 education and community college education, what they're calling K through 14 education. There's some constitutional spending requirements that the state has to pay out for K through 14 education, as well as expenditures related to the state's rainy day fund, which is kind of what it's colloquially known as. So both projections do include both of those expenditures and both of those financial elements, but for the most part, the two big differences in the budget proposals between the governor's budget and the LAO's budget proposal is the health of the economy and the stock market overall.
And what do legislators have to say about this at the Assembly and the State Senate? Have you been able to attend any of these sessions?
Yes, I have. I've been able to attend both meetings in full, and there are concerns among lawmakers that the budget proposal issued by the governor wouldn't allocate enough money to Medi-Cal, which of course is seeing major cuts from the federal government. And there's also concerns that there are major cuts, not just from the federal government, but from the state government to CalFresh, and that this would result in a significant number of people currently enrolled on Medi-Cal and people enrolled in CalFresh are not going to have access to those benefits anymore. Of course, we've seen Medi-Cal issue new rules that those who are undocumented or illegal immigrants who are not currently enrolled in Medi-Cal will not be able to now after January 1st, which of course we are past now. So there are concerns that there are some people who are going to be able to access health insurance through Medi-Cal in a tiered system. One lawmaker said yesterday in the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee that some people are going to have access to Medi-Cal, some people have some access to Medi-Cal, but won't receive full benefits, and some won't have access to Medi-Cal at all anymore. So there are real concerns that federal budget cuts and the governor's budget, if it were to pass as is, would not allocate enough state funding to backfill Medi-Cal and CalFresh, the Medi-Cal and CalFresh budgets, respectively. And that's going to have real impacts on people's lives.
Well, Madeline, thank you so much for your time on this. I'm sure we'll keep up with this story and more. If you want to keep up with us at the Center Square, please go to thecentersquare.com